afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second Comms and Question webinar of 2024. My name is Jordan Ray. I'm a senior narrative consultant and principal with Curious Public. Just as an FYI, if you like the discussion today and you want to see more, you can check out the webinar section of our website to find all past episodes. In today's webinar, we're going to talk about creativity in the workplace. In a survey earlier this year, the World Economic Forum found that 70% of employers say that creative thinking will be the most in-demand skill this year. The applications of creativity are becoming more and more apparent every year. Creativity helps you solve problems at work and develop solutions no other company is using, and it's a critical skill to have when your organization has to adapt to change. But how do we nurture creativity in the workplace as professional communicators? Writing a book, composing a song, or creating a piece of art is already a lot of work, but applied creativity is a whole other ball of wax. When you use your creative skills at work, whether it's writing a speech, planning a content calendar, or developing a new visual identity, you're using creativity in pursuit of a specific goal with a defined set of restrictions, and usually a deadline. So to help us dig deeper into this question, we've got a panel of professional creatives, each working in different disciplines. So without further ado, please let me introduce you. So first we've got Matthew Aubie, and Matt is a partner and creative director at Obs & Mugs, Inc., an independent branding agency whose work can be seen in healthcare, education, and other industries. He is also a brand building expert with nearly 2 decades of experience. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jordan. Hello, everybody.
Awesome. Next, we've got Tiffany Gooch. Tiffany is the executive lead for public engagement and communications at the Peel District School Board. She's also a strategic planning and communications consultant, writer, singer, passionate advocate for racial and gender equality, inclusion, and justice, and is a columnist and political pundit frequently seen on CBC and CTV. Tiffany, welcome.
Thank you, Jordan.
And last but certainly not least, we have Robert Rotenberg. Robert is a celebrated Canadian criminal defense lawyer, author, and creative writing teacher. He is best known for his gripping legal thriller novels, including Old City Hall and Heart of the City. His latest novel, What We Buried, promises an equally thrilling read and can be found wherever books are sold. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert. Now, we all have questions for our great guests today, but you can also weigh in on the discussion or ask questions through the chat. I think Robert is having some technical difficulties, so he'll be rejoining us in a moment. So let's dive right into it. Matt, we'll start with you. Why do you think that creativity matters in communications?
Yeah, it's a good first question because it sort of opens up everything pretty broadly and pretty generally. So I think when we think about communications, the way that we think about it is it's sort of an interesting profession to be in because everybody does communications, even non-professionals, right? Everybody every day is communicating with everybody around them, with themselves. And as a professional, it's essentially our job to do that just in an elevated way or a more thoughtful way or a more strategic way. And what can separate a professional approach to communications from maybe your everyday approach to communications is creativity. And the way that at least I define creativity in this sense is that it's the ability to ideate, right? It's the ability to sort of take a situation and look at it from as many different angles or approaches as you can to find the most appropriate strategic position on it. And so when we're thinking about communications, professional communications, being able to be creative means that you're going to be able to basically circle the situation, approach, whether it's something like what we do, whether it's a visual identity or a brand strategy or whatever it might be, to look at it in ways that not everybody might look at it, and in doing that find many different approaches, and in doing so hopefully land on something that's a little bit special, a little bit more meaningful than what might just come out of sort of everyday thinking. So it's sort of this it's kind of the ability to just to be free and to wander and to explore and be okay in that space, to feel confident in that space and to have the permission essentially to speak to approach things in a way that maybe wouldn't be done instinctually. It's going sort of beyond the natural approach to things.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, Matt, especially today when there is so much content out there wherever we're looking, whether it's on social media or on Netflix, or even in the kinds of news that we can consume. If you're, unless you're doing something maybe a little bit differently, or maybe doing the same thing a little bit differently, or you're doing something else that no one's even done before, it's hard to punch through as a communicator, because there's people just tune it out. Yeah, Tiffany, do you have any follow up on that?
Yeah, and I was also just as Matt was speaking there, I feel like we move really quickly in communications. It's fast paced. You might need something written very, very quickly or created very quickly. And so I think infusing and always having a core of creativity asks you sometimes to slow down and create something that may not have come out of, the templates that would have been, in your package to go, and work from. And so I think that sometimes we're pushed into this space of make this happen now, find the answer right this second. And I think taking the approach of seeing creativity as a muscle, you're flexing over the entire year, all of the time in different ways, always sort of gathering ideas that can be gone back to and touched and used in different ways. I journal a lot, so I'm always coming up with ideas and then going back. I might not need them right now, but going back to them later and trying to see how they can be infused. But I think we can get stale in communications if sometimes you'll have the same clients for a long time. In my consulting experience, sometimes or even in education, it was the exact same thing happens every year. So we sort of pull out this whole package of what we did before and maybe try and refresh it a little bit. And so I think there's something to be said about stepping outside of that, taking a walk, enjoying finding some way to have some inspiration and whatever that looks like for you, and revisiting some of the ideas that maybe didn't come up immediately, but going back to them and bringing them into the process, because you'll find something that is going to connect with your audience in a much better way if it's connecting with you in a different way than some of the templates that we like to start with when we were working very quickly, especially.
Yeah, and it can be helpful to have those templates, like, as you say, to start with, right? Because we're often working on deadlines and things, but they can, to Matt's point, like, to be creative is to have those be helpful and not kind of box you in as a communicator, and prevent you from doing the thing that might actually be the best in the situation that you're talking about. Now, you kind of touched on something that gets into the next question. And I think for a lot of people, they wouldn't see themselves as working in a specifically creative field, right? But creativity actually has a lot of applications for any sector. So, Tiffany, do you think communications is a creative field? And kind of building on what we've already been talking about, why do you think creativity is important to make communications just important in communications and to make them as impactful as they can be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think it's a creative field, and I feel when I worked in early politics before communications and other spaces, I always felt like I needed to somehow separate out this artist version of me and this version of me that was, a operator that could make these things happen. And I thought they were different personalities. And I did a lot of singing and songwriting and open mic nights, and they were literally just like these two personas. There was this person that was songwriting and creative writing, and on the other side of it, I felt like I needed to, put on the suit jacket and become this other person in the other space. And so it really wasn't until I realized that they were all the same person. First of all, I had to bring, and my ability to bring all of those things to my work was really what made was my differentiator. And so I think it took that time of realizing that in communications, and as Matt mentioned, there are so many people in communications, whether they think they are or not, or it's something that they're doing, they're entrepreneurs and also communicators and doing different things. And so I think there's something to be said about, bringing your whole self to that work, and allowing the ways that you find inspiration for your art, whatever that may look like, to be infused in the process and communications. And then I come from a family of makers. All of the women in my life made something. My grandmother was a quilter. My mom is always sort of going through different phases of making and creating different things. And I think a lot of it came from, finding a way to make something really beautiful out of nothing. And I've as I've gone through politics and communications, it's also occurred to me that in those spaces, when we're trying to create something really incredible out of nothing, that's the same skill set. We're looking around the room, we're trying to figure out how we weave together something that is going to resonate with people and is going to connect with them. And so I think that the more that we acknowledge that this is a part of, that you should be bringing that part of yourself to your work, I think the better our teams end up being. You need a safe space to do that. So the team around you needs to appreciate and value that. And so I think that's a whole other conversation about how we don't drive the creativity out of our employees on our teams, and encourage that. But I think it's hugely important, and absolutely something that is at the core of all of the best communicators I've ever worked with, yourself included.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw to you for a minute there, Robert. Why do you think creative is so important in communications? And how do you, we'll talk a little bit about this later. You've got, you wear so many different hats. How do you bring, as Tiffany's talking about, like the different parts of yourself to the different jobs that you have to do?
Well, first of all, I had to get creative to get online, because for some reason my office doesn't work. Suddenly it didn't work. So I've had to grab my laptop, and I'm sitting here in a conference room without the fancy background.
Right.
So I'm sorry I missed the beginning of what everyone said. I get asked every day, like, how can you write books and also be a lawyer? And my kind of standard answer is, being a writer has made me a better lawyer, and being a criminal lawyer, where I see people's lives exposed to me every day, has made me a better writer. I grew up in a family. It's interesting, Tiffany, hearing you talk about your family. I'm the third of 4 boys, and my parents were great readers. And my older brother, David, and I were 2 writers, and we both kind of credit a lot to my mother, who was just kind of a storyteller and could really kind of understand people and perceive people. But I was kind of brought up, like my brother David, my unfortunately late brother now, David, he was a creative one in the family. And I don't know, I was an English student. I was always writing, but I never thought of myself as a quote unquote artist or creative person. My brother went to Yale Drama School. He was a theater director and professor and teacher his whole life in the arts. I'll try to keep it simple. I always wanted to be a writer, and I spent many years trying not to be a lawyer. I spent about 10 years as a magazine editor and radio producer. And then when I went back to practicing law, the very first day I went to criminal court, I came home, I started my first novel. And I think there's a part of me that just thought I wouldn't have been able to survive in that one world without the other world. So it's pretty chaotic, but on a good day, I walk down to my local cafe and I spend about 2 hours writing, and then I come to my office and do my law stuff, and then I go home and I sit on my porch and I edit what I wrote that day. And I think I kind of need both, and I think both feed, one feeds the other. I'm a very creative lawyer. I'm a criminal lawyer, but just very simply, the other day I had what's called a sentencing hearing. You write something called a factum, which most lawyers write. It's very boring, very dry. And my best friend's a judge. He said, "Oh, I hate reading what most lawyers write." Well, I write it as a story.
Right.
I wrote this sentencing hearing. I said, well, here's the theme of this. And then I kept repeating the theme. And at the very end, I went right back to the theme. So I write a great deal. In fact, I never go into a meeting with a Crown attorney or a judge unless I've written a really comprehensive memo and really understood people's stories. So to me, in many ways, it's storytelling. Everything I do is storytelling, whether it's just an email to a friend or talking to you guys here. So that's kind of a short answer to a long answer to a short question. I mean,
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's I think there seems to be a bit of a theme of bringing the other disciplines or even skill sets or experiences that you've had in your life and bringing them to your work is part of what helps you be creative, because you can kind of perhaps put yourself in the shoes of multiple different kinds of people and be like, oh yeah, like when I was in court the other day, like I did this exact thing or something that was like that, and kind of being able to put your brain in those different situations allows you to adapt to different situations.
yeah, can I make one more note? It occurred to me one day, my father was a doctor who really never wanted to be a doctor. And he was an extraordinary physician. He was a radiologist, but he was interested in everything else.
Mhm.
And I remember he had 4 sons. He didn't want any of us to become doctors, which we weren't. And I was doing a murder trial one day, and I just was about choking, something called petechiae glands. And I went to the U of T medical library. Read about 30 articles. And I said to him, medicine's not that hard. You just research all that stuff. He said, yeah, no, it's not hard. It's just, and it occurred to me that in our jobs, it's a reactive thing. People come to me with their problems. They've been arrested, and it's my job is to be creative in a way to deal with their situation. But if I'm writing a novel, it's the exact opposite. It's all on me because there's the quote unquote the blank page. So it's a really different part of your brain. You can be creative in your reactive work. My father invented all sorts of procedures. He was very creative as a doctor. But the creative side of your brain isn't reacting, isn't not problem solving. It's not doing Wordle in the morning. It's actually creating your own Wordle. And I think somehow the two of them energize each other, at least for me.
That's really interesting. And that's kind of actually a good segue into the next question, Robert, because at least for me, I've always found that, creativity isn't like flipping a light switch, right? Even though that's often what the work requires, right? It's like, okay, you have to write this thing for this project, go. But if you're going to do something that's really going to wow people, it's not always that easy to just be like, well, of course, it's just going to be this. So how do you kind of get in the zone of being creative? How do you put yourself in a place where you can bring those experiences and kind of know, like, I need to go to that U of T library and research this? And Robert, how do you get there?
I don't know. It sounds like a compulsion.
Okay.
I mean, okay, yesterday I got contacted by somebody who wants to do a TV series about a really well-known book. I can't tell you what it is. So last night, not only was I thinking about the movie I'd seen of this and going online and reading about it, but I'm just thinking about it. So when I talked to him this morning, I said, my idea for the series is totally different than what most people think. I think it's about this. And he said, that's exactly what I'm thinking. So maybe compulsion is the right word. It's like once it's like an itch. You just have to get it out. So as my brother said once, he said, if you're in the shower and you're not thinking about a scene in your book or a problem or a dialogue or something, then you're not writing. So, and the same thing happens with work. If this case I had last week took over my life for a week and I could barely sleep just thinking about what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do. So, I mean, we all have that. All the people here online are hardworking people, and you get that super focus on one thing. And so I think you can be creative in almost anything you do. I learned really, my mentor was Edward Greenspan, whose office I'm in, Eddie once said 90% of the time you're going to be pleading your clients guilty. So think of very, very creative ways to do that. So I always thought it was a great lesson, not just about that particular thing, but I mean, I try to make almost every single thing I do interesting, fun to read, simple, clean, clear, cogent. And I think there's a lot of creativity in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, how about you? How do you get your head in the zone of when you need to come up with a new idea?
So I'll say, like, I'll be transparent. I don't think that I do anything to get in the zone exactly, right? Like the reality is this is a job. So like you show up to your job each day and you have your hours that you work, and they're what they are, and you find that time in your calendar to approach whatever the project is that you have on the go. And there's a big degree of this where you just hope that when you sit down to do that work, something's going to happen inside of your head that will come out onto the page in some way. I think Robert's right, where it's not necessarily like at that moment where I'm, clicking the pen or the mouse and moving the pixels or writing the notebook. The creativity is probably happening before it, right? It's sort of it's the constant background considerations that you're having, the observations that you're making, that when you sit down to do the thing, it's actually a little less like I never sit down and be like, all right, it's time to be creative. Right. I'll sit down and I'll be like, it's time to solve this problem or to do this task that I have to do, that I hope all of the preparation I've done before I sat down there has sort of prepped me to do that work. And so that takes a lot of stress out of being creative, I'll say. I think the only part of the actual zone time, we'll call it, when you're being creative, when you're doing the thing, you're making the thing, is that hopefully if you're prepared properly and you're trained properly, being creative in that moment means you're giving yourself permission to just do things that maybe are unprecedented, or to do things that are, beyond the template, things like that. It's not uncommon for us to do some work that we know is inappropriate for the final outcome. Like we know it's not going to be the final solution. It's not what the client will sign off on, but it's important to explore it and sometimes even share it, just to make sure that, everyone's sort of exploring in the same space. And in doing so, you're sort of sharing the creativity with the client as well. And they're maybe broadening their perspective on what this thing could be. Not as extreme as that thing we're showing them that's terrifying, but it's more interesting than what they were expecting. And so that kind of opens up their mind too. So yeah, I think Robert's right on that. It's this compulsion that's happening, not on purpose. It's just sort of happening in the background that you need to allow happen. You need to give yourself permission to just always be aware, always be observing, and kind of always be thinking about the problem that you're solving.
I like that idea of giving yourself permission to creative and think outside the box. Tiffany, is there anything that you find gets in the way of that for you? Like things that if you're trying to be creative, that's like, no, I need to get rid of this.
Well, if I really need to get something done, I'll clean my house first. I feel like my brain just sort of needs to go do something else with my hands. As mentioned earlier here, while I'm doing something else, I've figured out the answer. Now I just need to go and get a piece of paper and write it down. I'm always carrying paper, always have a journal nearby, so that wherever the idea happened to come from, I'm writing it down. I also do a lot of writing in the morning to just sort of brain dump. And but I do find a walk is usually one of my best ways out of an unstuck, get unstuck when needed. And so whether it's sort of a walk in nature or a walk to like my favorite neighborhood, which is the Junction. And so a quick artist state in the Junction, and I'm brimming with energy. And I used to also host creative salons. And so would bring together a bunch of different friends from different, just different areas of my life, and leave a bunch of, just paint out and instruments and great food, great music around, let different people DJ for different periods of time. So the vibe changed over the course of the evening. I'd have a question for the night for us to try to answer, but who cares if we do or don't? And so I say that to say that I don't think all creativity is alone and by yourself either. And so I think my best moments have usually been in jamming situations where I'm with a bunch of people and we're riffing. We've almost like a jazz session kind of going on and playing. And I think that also sort of brings me back to also the concept of playing, it not necessarily always needing to be that you're creating something for the client or for something, flexing that creative muscle is just sometimes playing for no reason and playing around with ideas and not, having some time that's put aside to just, explore some ideas and jam with your friends or on your own. And I'll add one other item. I've loved one thing coming out of the pandemic, which is that, in a lot of ways we're working remotely, we're able to work in our own spaces. And so I've been able to sort of create a home space that also inspires and, is created very much intentionally for me to be inspired, whether through music or the way that my books are displayed. And so always thinking about, sometimes we have to go out to a space that maybe isn't always going to bring out the best in our creative energy, but we can usually most of our time right now also be working in our own space and identifying what it is that helps us. In my case, it's some burning sweetgrass and really, really good music. And that will, be the environment that helps me, get onto the page what I was trying to work through. But really just, I think, coming back down to this idea that every piece of creativity doesn't need to be for something. And my son's really taught me that. I would build a beautiful tower with him at he's 3 years old and he'd tear it down immediately and I'd have to start over and learn to find the fun in the build and finding new ways to do things, and that the action, the end result wasn't what we needed to be focused on, but the process and the having fun in it.
Yeah, I'm definitely detecting a theme of kind of fun and passion. It's I think perhaps creativity is so fundamentally human and a fundamental expression of who we are, that when we are able to create something, whether it's a tower with your 3-year-old, or whether it's a new book that's really gonna make people be like, wow, that was an incredible story, or whether it's just something that you're presenting to a client that you think is really kind of interesting. I think there's an element there that, if you can get excited about creativity, that seems to help the process. And I think, Matt, I think talent is definitely part of being creative, but I think it's also a skill set that you can kind of nurture and hone and be trained on. There's all kinds of university and college courses for this, especially a solid creative process. So maybe, Matt, you can tell us what your creative process is like and how you teach that to your team.
Sure. And so actually, like the process that we follow in the studio is actually, it's going to sort of counter a lot of what Tiffany just said in that it's not necessarily about play so much as it's a lot about preparation, I would say. So in any significant work that we do, the majority of the upfront, I'll say 50% of the project, sometimes more, is just in the research, where there is literally no creation happening on our end. It's just pure listening, pure observation, talking to people, letting them say what they need to say without us having any reaction to it, and just collecting as much information as intel as we possibly can about the topic. Because the reality is, like, we're a design studio. We're not a technology company. We are not a municipality. We're not anything that our clients typically are. So the reality is we come into all of these relationships as the experts in the brand and design side, and they're the experts in whatever it is that they do. And so the first part of any creative process is just trying to figure out what exactly that thing is that they do and why they do it, like why it's interesting, why it matters. Once we know that, then that's sort of where I suppose the play can come into place. We have all these sort of parameters now in place, right? Where we understand what the landscape looks like. We sort of understand what maybe the rules might be in the world we're playing in now all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And now we can start to explore that space very specifically. So it's less so that we have a blank page in front of us. We actually have a very busy page in front of us that we have to try and find meaning and find some sort of direction in or clarity in. And so we have all that research, we explore that research, and that's where it becomes very human and sort of very, I think that's where it becomes very abstract. It's just a matter of, discussing with the team, brainstorming, letting time go by and letting it sort of, soak and understand what's going on. And then it comes back to the idea where then you sit down, you hopefully all that work has done what it has to do. And you hope that in that moment that you're clicking the mouse or drawing on your pad, something's going to come out that makes sense based on all that research. Creativity is really, I think it's less about the artist at the canvas, at least in the work that we do. Obviously, the artist at the canvas is a beautiful creative expression, but in what we do, it's really more about letting the information guide us in ways that we're not sure is going to happen at the very beginning, and let it take us where it needs to take us.
It's interesting to think about. When I was doing prep for the webinar, I came across a quote that I'm paraphrasing, kind of said something to the effect of, once you learn the ways of the masters, then you can start to do something new. So it's kind of like, once you've sort of understood and sat in the material and done the preparation and research and kind of soak it in and feel like, okay, I kind of understand where we are, then it's almost like evidence-driven creativity, in a way.
Well, the important thing that we like that in the professional space, that's as the director is always on my mind, is like, there's going to come a point in this process when I'm going to need to explain this to somebody who wasn't here when we were creating this.
Right.
And if we don't have that information to explain how we got there, right? Like we're not all living in trading spaces where we just show up one day and we say, ta-da, here's the work you get, take it or leave it. Right? We need to justify it. And so it's really important to have that sort of information driven ideas that happen.
Yeah. And from a work perspective, Tiffany, you've been on the consultant side and the client side. When you can kind of show the client sort of how you got there, and it sort of makes sense to them, then they're more likely to buy in.
Yeah, no, and Matt's absolutely right. Everyone's not in the room in the moment that you all had the aha. You have to almost recreate it with the client again, and so it's another world altogether, and telling the story of the product that you put together. It always breaks my heart when you put together maybe 3 versions of something, and the best one is the one they're not going to choose, but you put it out in front of them just so that you could satiate your ego of what is really good work of your team. And so I think it's a whole other skill set as well, to be able to present work, help people understand why you think it's going to resonate with their audiences and why it's the right piece. And then, that's what I think makes this work so difficult, is that at the end of the day, you are producing for a client, and what they need is what's going to be what they're going to use. And you've got to sort of walk away at that moment and allow them to take what they choose out of it. And then on the client side, our budgets are getting smaller and smaller, and this is I think that other space we talked about earlier. If you want fast work and you aren't really caring as much about how good it is, you need it on the deadline and in hand, and are really watching those billable hours along the way. And so I think your client maybe not even have the patience for the story that you need to tell to get them to really understand the best work that's in front of them. And so but yes, absolutely a whole other world for how you are able to communicate those ideas that you came up with. And also this is another space too where always found it interesting how much you're sort of also giving away ideas in that process. Like you're giving them several different options, and who knows what's going to be used later or in some other way. And so I've always found difficult part of the process where there's no way to really put the true value, I think, on what it was you created that was never used. And I guess to answer my own question from my earlier pieces, to put it aside and bring it back in the quilting later and something else that you get to do, and to know that all of it's going to still be useful in the future.
Yeah.
Jordan, you said a really important word, which is work. It's work, and I think it's kind of a myth that you have this wonderful creative moment and everything happens. Scott Fitzgerald said, "There's no writers, there's only rewriters." Picasso said that nothing great has been done without extreme isolation. So he lived a life where he would go to the studio every day for about 5 hours by himself. The rest of the time he was either drinking coffee with his friends or sleeping with a different woman. But the point is that it's work. One of the things that my editors love about me is that I always make my deadlines. And I love deadlines because they do force you to create, to make it happen. And I think that's important. And I think that the other thing, it's a bit of an underrated value, but the simple value of thinking. Lee Child, the writer, once said to me, I spend most of my time looking out the window, and kind of picking up on what you said, Matt. It's almost like soup, like you're collecting a million different ingredients all the time. It's a simple example. The next book I'm going to write after this one is going to be set in the displaced persons camp in Germany in 1945. Don't tell anyone, okay? So for the last 2 years, anytime I see anything, I hear anyone who was born at DP camp, I'm just collecting all this stuff. I have no idea what the story is going to be, but I know it's in there. Agatha Christie once said that she got her best ideas, to pick up on what you said, Tiffany. She got her best ideas doing the dishes. I love doing boring, monotonous, really physical tasks and just letting my mind think through things. The other thing I wanted to say is it's really important now, as a writer and even as a criminal lawyer, I'm mostly alone, but it's really important to use key people. So when I teach writing classes to lawyers or to companies, I make the people, whatever they've written, I make them give it to somebody else to read to them. When I finish a novel, I hire an actor, and I spend about 4 days with them reading the manuscript, and me with a red pen just, that's boring, that's boring, that's boring. And my editors say I'm the least defensive writer that they've ever met, in part because I was an editor for a long time.
Sure.
But it's really important not to really listen. And my way of using my editor is I'll make a list of like 80% is good. These are my 10 or 15 questions. And usually I'll come in saying A, B, and she'll say, well, what about C, D? And then I'll end up hopscotching over to E, F. So I think it's important to choose the right people to work with. They have to be critical, not egotistically critical, but positively critical, and to keep your mind open to it, but always be looking for that, that click when it finally works.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue to the next question, Robert, because a really important part of creative work is feedback, and sometimes feedback can drive us nuts, and sometimes it's helpful, and sometimes it's less helpful. And sometimes a client can have a legitimate concern, but the solution they propose is way off base. And Robert, you've worked with a broad range of editors. You've worked as an editor, you've worked with different colleagues, you've had all kinds of different clients. So how do you make feedback a useful part of your work?
So are we talking to me or to Matt?
To you, Robert.
Oh, to me?
Yeah.
Well, I get feedback from editors, from readers, from judges, from clients. Funny story is I'll get letters that say, oh, I loved your book, and then they'll find like one little thing that I got wrong. And they'll say, oh, you got this wrong, you got that wrong. But then they'll say, oh, but I loved your book. And to me, that's a real success, because in a book, what you want to do is you want to create an alternate reality that people believe. And so if people are upset, that's fine. And my very first book, which was called Old City Hall, which was very, very successful, but there was one New York critic who said, well, there's great things that he said, but I found that the dialogue, a lot of the characters sounded the same. Well, I never, ever forgot that. So every time I write a character, I want that character, that you can identify that character just by the way they speak. It's not easy to do. That to me is just a real great example of using criticism. There's no point in being defensive. Just hang on 1 second, sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
I can't talk.
I know. Matt, this is something that we talked about too a little bit, on how sometimes the client will tell you something that's it's something that is a concern, that they're right to be concerned about, but the feedback they suggest is like would just not be good for them. So how do you get them where they need to be?
Can I just throw one more thing in?
Yeah, sure.
It's better go to Matt, but I work with a lot of up and coming writers, and they'll tell me, you'll read it and there's a hole in the narrative. And they'll say, well, I mean, I think people can figure that out. And I just say to them, unfortunately, every reader doesn't bother to phone you every time and say, I can't quite figure that out. So sometimes we think something's on the page. And sometimes I do, I think, oh, and then my editor will say, well, how did that happen? It's like, it's in my brain, but it's not there. And in the end, all that matters is what's on the page or the submissions I make in court. So sometimes when you get that feedback, it's very, very useful because you miss something. And sometimes if you miss something, I think you need to take responsibility for it. Instead of saying, oh, it's a dumb client, well, that's your client. You didn't communicate with them. That's your creative gap. I see you nodding your head, Matt.
Yeah, well, I think it's, it comes back to the idea that it's very uncommon, if ever, that the client is in the space that you're in. So typically the client isn't in communications or design, but they'll often come back with feedback like, we want that to be red, or we want to use whatever, make that this font. And that might be the wrong solution. Like that might just be a terrible solution. That might be a dumb idea. But the reality is they're proposing that idea because there is a real issue that connects back to the thing that they understand, right? They're probably changing the color because they know in their space that color, there's a sensitivity to it or something, whatever it might be. Color is a little, sort of surface level, but gets the idea. So this idea that when that feedback comes in, the initial reaction, honestly, in the studio will be, oh, it's a bad idea. But the second reaction is, okay, where is that idea? Like, why is that idea being proposed? Like, what's the real problem here? And then the way that you steer them that way is, and this is where like the human relationship comes into it. If it's the relationship where you should show them what they've asked for, but then show them alternatives, and then as a professional to do your job well and explain to them why the alternatives might be the more appropriate direction to go. If you do your job right, they're going to go in that direction. So it's a matter of, people feel like, I think, because going back to that very first idea, because everyone does communications, I think everyone comes into these professional relationships feeling like they need to do the work as well, right? I'm sure in the writing space, clients feel like, well, I know how to write, so I should be able to give writing feedback. What we try to do is create a space where the client doesn't feel like they need to take on that role. I never want a client to feel like they need to be a designer when they're working with us. They need to give us human feedback, and we need to respond with professional design solutions. So it's just a matter of interpreting, listening, and trying to understand where the real problem is that the solution they're proposing is coming from.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're right too. I should say that. Sometimes the client's just right. Like, it should be red. and when that happens, like, let it, like, just don't have ego. Like, let the solution be the solution. Yeah.
Yeah. For the last question, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask you guys where you think creativity is going, because for me, creativity, as I said, is a very human kind of activity. And creativity has evolved over the centuries as the tools that we use to be creative have evolved with us. And today we've got generative AI that's generating, body copy and images and graphic design suggestions and book plots. So Tiffany, as a communicator and as a creative professional, and and we've got two parents of 3-year-olds on the panel today. What do you think the future of creativity looks like with these new tools?
It honestly, it feels really limitless. It's shifting and evolving at such an incredibly fast pace that's really difficult to say what it will look like. But someone once said to me, you have all of the information, at your fingertips as a leader that, this president would have had in this, a century ago or something along those lines, just based on how much information was available to us in the internet. And so I would say, taking that to this, our children have so much more at their fingertips for ideas and inspiration and things that they're touching that we would have never seen, in our lifetimes, or ideas to connect with culture in different places that, we would have needed to travel to really get a chance to really connect with. So my hope is that virtual reality is always and continues to be coupled with analog, that there's a connection both to how we're experiencing a digital world, and then, browsing and still traveling and still, experiencing culture and still, but being inspired and then following your curiosity into that space and then seeing how that's going to touch and impact your mosaic. And so I'm really excited to see, what can be created. I'm always impressed with my niece and nephew, as they're coming quickly and, oh, I just made this video in the last 2 seconds that I would have spent a month trying to put together, and would have never been able to do at their age. And so I realize, even for our generation sort of coming up, as we were just starting to tinker and play and have this much information at our fingertips and trying to figure out how to use it, I think it'll just be that much more important that our education systems are moving along as quickly and aren't trying to stop it, are understanding that, that people are going to use this. So we need to figure out how to create critical thinkers, that also can differentiate, reality from, what's being created in that world, but also, be a remixer that's creating something new.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's yeah, I love the optimism of that answer, because it's like, when we get new tools, that means we can do more things. What do you think, Robert? What do you think the future of creativity looks like? Big question.
Well, when I think about this, I kind of grew up in a mono world where there was like 3 TV stations and 2 or 3 radio stations. But that obviously had horrible limitations, but I think the limitation is the reverse now. I'll just give you an example. About 10 years ago, all the rage was self-publishing. Everyone was talking about how great self-publishing is. And you'd hear some story about, someone in Arkansas who wrote a story and sold 1 million copies. But for every one of those people in Arkansas, there is hundreds of thousands of horrible, boring, lousy books that are out there. Now, there's thousands of TV shows, thousands of stations. So I think the challenge is different. I think the challenge is to really be exceptional, because it's the exceptional that's going to really, really blast through. And if you're just content with being average, if there was only 3 TV stations and you were on one of those 3 TV stations with an average show, people had to watch it. But now people don't have to watch anything. They don't have to read anything. They don't have to. So I think the challenge is really to be exceptional. If you look back at times when there's been big industrial change, like at the beginning of the 1900s, when the printing press, well, in the 1400s when the printing press came in, and the 1900s when there's the Industrial Revolution, that's when, that's a good example. Like that's when Dickens emerged. And to talk about a literary context, well, if you think about films, I mean, there's so many thousands of films now, but yet still the 2 or 3 great ones everyone's talking about. So I think the challenge is, with so much quantity, to really make sure everything you do is better. You've got to work harder and make it better. That's what I think the real challenge is.
Right. More content means more competition. Last word goes to you, Matt, and then we have one question from the audience.
Yeah, I can be brief. I think in the future, so just like touching on the idea of AI and the idea of the more volume and just more saturation. I think it's going to be continually easier and easier to create things, right? Like the ability to make a picture of a dinosaur flying through New York City with a top hat on. Being able to make that image was never the creative part. That was the technical skill part, right? I think where the creativity, so that's going to be easier. What's going to be harder is actually sort of fighting against the saturation of content, in that we see so much that it's so easy now, I think, to fall into the trap of just following the line and doing what's being done, because you're seeing so much. You're seeing so much great stuff that it's really easy to be like, that's really great, I'm going to do that. Before, when you didn't have all that saturation coming at you, it's probably easier to sort of be your own thinker and your own individual. But now it's really easy to be affected by what you're seeing. So creation will be a lot easier. Creativity will be a little bit harder.
Yeah.
What?
So our audience, and thank you for that, Matt. Our audience question is looking for tips. So I'm going to ask all of you. They want to know how you overcome creative block. So I'll go around and ask each of you, what's your number one way to overcome creative block, writer's block, whatever it is. I'm going to start with you, Tiffany.
Sure. I think I said a couple of things earlier, so I'll try and come up with a new one here. And honestly, it's time in nature, whether gardening or going for a walk. I find nature to be the best sort of creative force to really help me see how long some things take to bloom, and understand that I might need to repot something to really give it the space that it needs, and to really follow the growth of something. And so I always find that when I can't really get through something, turning my mind and my attention back to and really immersing myself in nature is the answer.
Yeah, right on. What about you, Matt?
One cheat is to ask AI, have someone else do the thinking for you at the beginning. That helps to sort of get an idea down, good or bad. And the other one, like the easy one, is just like, if you can, just stop working on it and come back to it later, right? Like you're being blocked because you've been thinking too hard, or it's just not the right time. So just stop and come back to it.
Yeah, give yourself a break. Robert, do you have any tricks to overcome writer's block?
Yeah, this is something everyone can do. If you have a floor and a towel, lie on the floor, put the towel over your head, and just make yourself think. It sounds easy. It's actually very difficult to do. My books are really complex. They're not just linear. They're like, and when I really get blocked and I know I'm just avoiding it, I just make myself lie down and just think, wait a sec, how is this going to happen? How is this? And yeah, lie on the floor, put a towel over your head. No radio, no Spotify, nothing.
Great.
Just you and your little brain.
Kind of forcing yourself to confront the problem.
Yep.
Yeah, I like it. I think we might actually have time for this one more question. We've got, okay, hold on. So James asks, how would you recommend building your creative skill sets when billable hour pressure incentivizes producing with time efficacy and discards the creative process?
I have a simple answer. Everybody has an hour in their life. I don't buy it. I don't care. When I was at law school and we were working like crazy, I still always found an hour to write or to read a Raymond Chandler book or something. Everybody has an hour. If you spend an hour doing, John Grisham said once, if you write 5 pages a day, in a year, you've got a book. So everybody has an hour. I don't buy it.
Okay, so kind of just kind of chipping away at it, with whatever time you have, just trying to make progress that way. Okay.
It's like exercise. It's you either do it or you don't do it.
Yeah. What do you think, Matt?
I don't know if I totally understand the context of the question, but like I guess like the idea is if you're on a time constraint, that's implying there isn't time for creative work. But if what you do, and I'll say we do this as communicators, is inherently creative, I don't know if you can escape it, right? Like you can do bad creative work, you can do more thoughtful creative work, but unless you're just literally copying something, plagiarizing something and giving it to the client, then it's going to be creative work, right? If the problem is time, then the creativity comes in creating clarity and some kind of engagement in the time that you have. Like it's one of those parameters that's part of that complicated page in front of you.
Yeah. What do you think, Tiffany? How do you build your creative skill set when you're under lots of pressure at work and you feel like you don't have time to be creative?
Yeah, I think for me, it's always just been making myself one of my clients and making my artist one of my own clients and saying, you know, I need this this time at a gallery, again, this jaunt through the junction, this moment to really be a part of what's filling me up and refilling me. And maybe I can't build that to a client necessarily, but I know it's going to impact how I'm servicing my clients. So just deciding that you're one of your clients and these are the things that you're going to need to be filled up enough to overflow into the work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so I'm told I can ask you guys for a speed round on this last one. And we'll do this the same order as we just did. So we'll do Robert, then Matt, then Tiffany. So what's your best tip for getting out of your own way with creative work? Not related to writer's block, but you know, maybe you're a bit too much of a perfectionist and it's like, oh, well, if I just did this and I just did this, then I could get it from an 85 to a 90.
Someone asked me what's the trick to writing a book. I said 5 words. Do you have a chair? So just start.
Just start. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Matt?
If I'm ever in my own way, I jump ahead to the presentation deck. I start to build that.
Right. Think about what the end product's going to be.
It looks nicer in the deck, so whatever you're getting stuck with, it's going to look better in that thing. So get to that thing right now.
Okay. Tiffany?
Mine is just to share with somebody because it might actually be better than I think it is. And I'm overthinking what I want it to be in the end. So that conversation with somebody, the sharing will probably just help me identify where I need to work or if it's done and I didn't know.
Yeah. Right on. Well, okay, we're going to call it there. Thanks again to Robert and Tiffany and Matt for joining us today. It's been really great to talk with you guys about creativity. I could probably talk about this for another 2 hours. A big thanks as well to my colleagues behind the scenes, Emma and Shannon, for making these webinars possible and for taking the questions from the audience and keeping me on time and figuring things out as we go. If you did join late, don't worry, we will be sharing the recording, so keep your eyes on your inbox. Thank you to all of you who joined us today in the audience, whether it was on time or late. We're just happy that you're here. From all of us at Curious Public, have a happy Pride. And be sure to catch our next webinar about communications in October. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.